I was really enjoying that. I kind of hated to hear it come to an end. Thank you very much, Mark. I want to say how deeply appreciative I am of the honor that you've given me by inviting me to do this. I appreciate this very much. I've been shown nothing but well, I wanted to say warmth and kindness, a lot of kindness, but for God's sakes, it's awfully cold here. I came from winter weather that isn't quite so cold. But anyway, here we are. But thank you so much. This comes at the end of 45 years for me in the classroom. I'm retiring this year, and this honor stands out as a great highlight, and I'm deeply appreciative. Thank you all very much. I address this lecture to the students, although I can't forget that your professors are also listening. In your 4 years of undergraduate education and in your lifetime of continued learning, this lecture will only be a tiny blip. In all likelihood, this evening will be mostly forgotten. My goal, therefore, is very modest. I will talk about Aquinas and Descartes, but what I have to say about Aquinas is just what any old fool could tell you, although I must say my credentials in that department are quite solid. I do, however, want to drive home one point about Descartes that might help you to think about him better, and perhaps in a way that might surprise you. Thomas Aquinas and René Descartes are two of the greatest philosophers in the Catholic tradition. Each philosopher recognized a robust, independent philosophy is needed to defend the soundness of natural science and also of theology. Both philosophers labored hard to defend a new and revolutionary scientific understanding of the world and of man's place in it. And both philosophers actively participated in the new science of their day. They both saw that the doctrine of creation is fundamental to their philosophical projects, and they agreed on some of the crucial tenets, and here are 5. Number 1, creation has a fundamentally philosophical meaning that human reason can understand fully. 2, the act of creation belongs to God alone, for it is an act that requires the infinite power of God. God's act of creating is free and generous. This world did not have to exist, and it did not have to exist in just the way that it now is. 3, creation is the making of creatures out of nothing. That is, there is no material cause in the creative action. The act of creation, thus, is not a kind of change, as though something pre-existent were thereafter changed into something new and different. 4, creation is ongoing. God is, right now, creating everything in the universe. Should God stop creating, absolutely nothing of this universe would exist. In this sense, God's creation and conservation are merely two different ways of looking at exactly the same divine act. 5, and last, creation in this philosophically understood sense has no implications for the revealed Christian, Jewish, and Muslim belief in the radical temporal beginning of the universe. The fact that the universe had an absolute beginning, Genesis 1:1 in the beginning, is fundamentally important to the faith. But this truth does not affect and is not affected by the basic philosophical understanding of creation. The philosopher supports the faith by showing that our world is a thoroughly created world. But the Christian story of God's initiating a relationship with us, of our disobedience, of our redemption, and eventual reunion is a completely separate matter. Thomas and Descartes share a remarkable and profound doctrine of creation. So remarkable, in fact, that scholars have been led to suppose that Descartes' doctrine of creation is fundamentally the same as Thomas. Tonight, however, I want to show you that, however important these similarities are, they mask differences that are huge and that finally undercut Descartes' attempt to provide a foundation for modern science. To begin with, let us consider what Thomas means by creation. Creation, Thomas always tells us, is the causing by God of being, or the Latin esse. Being is found throughout our world, but it is found in varying degrees. Some substances have a higher degree of being, some a lower, and being is found primarily in substances and then secondarily in accidents and actions. The varying degrees of being imply that there is a first absolute cause of being, a being whose essence is not distinct from its being, as is the case for all other beings. This being, God, is the cause of being by creating it ex nihilo, out of nothing. The expression ex nihilo indicates two crucial facts about the creative act, both of which we have seen. First, it is the making of things without any material cause. This is not a kind of change or generation. As we know in our world, there is no preceding stuff or potency out of which the creature is made. Second, the creature is always out of nothing in the sense that, of itself, without the ongoing causality of God, the creature would utterly cease to exist. In that sense, it is nothing. God is always creating so long as the creature is existing. This basic meaning of creation is, Thomas tells us, completely accessible to the philosophers. They can prove creation in this sense, and they have done so. And in this regard, Thomas attributes creation to Plato, to Aristotle, and to Avicenna. But notice that creation in this philosophical sense has nothing to do with time. It says nothing about a temporal beginning of the world. Christians, of course, as we have mentioned already, and Jews and Muslims believe that God did create a radical temporal beginning. And this fact is an important part of the story of our faith. This fact, however, has nothing to do with the basic philosophical meaning of creation with which we are concerned tonight. When Thomas says that God is causing the being of everything in our world, it might sound as though God is causing everything and that creatures are really causing nothing. But that would be a mistake. Consider the following analogy. God's causing being is like the sun causing living beings on earth. The sun is causing all living things. If the sun were to be destroyed, every living thing on earth would cease to be alive. Even the earth itself would cease to exist. All living things are constantly and entirely dependent on the causality of the sun for energy, heat, light, gravity, and so on. The sun, however, does not in any way exert the causality that living things do. It doesn't build nests, hunt for food, photosynthesize, or grow, although none of these activities could go on for an instant without the sun's constant causality. These living actions, however, are the actions of the living things and not the actions of the sun. Similarly, God is causing all being, creating or conserving it at all times. If God were to stop this creative action, everything would completely cease to exist. Everything would be annihilated. Nevertheless, God does not cause the actions of the creatures. The creatures are fully the causes of their own actions. In fact, God could not cause the same effect that the natural agent causes. If God made the kettle to boil without the fire, he would be causing not a natural effect, but a miracle. Only creatures can cause natural effects. Only God can cause nature to exist at all and to keep it in existence. Once it is in existence, it can operate on its own because God has so made it. God is, however, always operating intimately in everything at all times. God is not remote to the ongoing actions of his world, but he is not causing what creatures cause. Thomas frequently uses the analogy of the craftsman to his tools to explain the relation of God's causality to creatures' causality. God is the principal cause, and the creature is the instrumental cause. The carpenter cuts the board in half and uses a saw to do so. The skill of the carpenter employs the saw to achieve an end that the saw of itself could not achieve. But notice that the carpenter could not achieve his end without the saw. Its construction of hard steel and sharp, precisely positioned teeth allows the wood to be cut in a way that would be impossible without the saw. So, too, God providentially orders events in our world to achieve certain ends that creatures could not attain of themselves. But so also, God could not achieve these ends without the natural causality of the creatures. God wills, for example, the institution of a church, but this could not be brought about without the actions of human agents. The church achieves God's ends, but its doing so is not miraculous. We should notice that God, according to Aquinas, immediately causes the existence of all things by creating or conserving them by his ongoing creative act. But he causes things also in other indirect ways. Aquinas understood that things in our world are caused in fundamental ways by the heavenly bodies, the planets, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Thus, for example, the four fundamental elements out of which all things are made are themselves generated by the heavenly bodies. Earth, water, air, and fire account for the basic motions in upward and downward directions, and they account for what we would consider the chemical interactions of things. They can be generated and destroyed, but the agency of the heavenly bodies and of the separate substances is required to bring about this sort of change. Furthermore, all substantial change, according to Aquinas, can only occur because of the influence of the heavenly bodies. Matter, because of the elements out of which it is composed, can be disposed or not disposed to substantial change. And creatures such as us can bring appropriate substances into contact, but we cannot actually reduce the potency into act without the agency of the heavenly bodies. These heavenly bodies are, of course, moved by their separate substances, and these are moved ultimately by God. In this sense, therefore, God is not only immediately creating all creatures, but he is mediately moving them through the ongoing influence of the heavenly bodies, which he ultimately moves. Notice that this kind of mediate divine causality is entirely brought about through natural causes. The heavenly bodies are part of the natural world, and this natural world is one that is thoroughly interconnected. Nothing in this world operates in a causal vacuum. God, however, is the first mover of this world, and thus God is moving things, though he is not immediately pushing or pulling things around. I hope I have made Aquinas' position clear. God is causing all things in our world in three ways. First, he is constantly creating the being of all substances, accidents, and motions of the world. Second, in creating things, he gives them their natures and their natural powers. And third, he indirectly moves things because everything in this world is part of a causal matrix of beings that are dependent upon one another, and without this matrix, which is ultimately moved by God, nothing in this world can happen. In such a world, creatures, both volitional and natural, retain their full causal abilities. In fact, God cannot cause natural effects in this world without creatures. What then about Descartes? Descartes, as is well known, gives his famous argument for the existence of God in the third meditation that is based on the idea that the thinking thing has of God. This idea is an idea whose objective reality, or whose content, is of an infinitely perfect being. And since no finite being could have been the cause of this idea, we conclude that God must exist because only he could have been the cause of this idea. Immediately following this argument, however, Descartes turns his attention to his own existence, and about this he wonders what could be the cause of it. Since he only exists as a thinking thing, and since his body and material existence are irrelevant at this point, nothing physical, such as his parents, could be the cause. Furthermore, he reasons that he could not have been the cause of his own existence, for if he were, he would have given himself every possible perfection. But he knows that he is imperfect. Even if he had always existed, the problem would still remain. And now I'm going to quote Descartes. I do not escape the force of these arguments by supposing that I have always existed as I do now, as if it followed from this that there was no need to look for any other author of my existence. For a lifespan can be divided into countless parts, each completely independent of the others, so that it does not follow from the fact that I existed a little while ago that I must exist now, unless there is some cause which, as it were, creates me afresh at this moment. That is, which conserves me, for it is quite clear to anyone who attentively considers the nature of time that the same power and action are needed to conserve anything at each individual moment of its duration as would be required to create that thing anew if it were not yet in existence. Hence, the distinction between conservation and creation is only a conceptual one, and this is one of the things that is evident by the natural light. This argument, sometimes called the second causal proof, will be the focus of our attention on Descartes. Notice that this is an argument to prove that God exists as the creator of me out of nothing, ex nihilo. Notice also that this is an argument from effect to cause, and that the effect in question is not the mere idea of God, as it was in Descartes' first causal proof, nor is it the being, the esse, or existence of things, as it was for Aquinas. Rather, the effect is the duration, or the temporal existence of the thinking thing. It is not the existence of things that Descartes is trying to explain, but the duration or temporal existence of things. Furthermore, and this is absolutely crucial, duration, according to Descartes, is composed of discontinuous parts called moments. Each moment of time is completely causally separate from its preceding and its subsequent moment. The fact that you exist in this moment, Descartes is telling you, does not mean that you will exist in any following moment, unless the following moment or moments are created out of nothing. Each of us had a first moment of existence, before which we did not exist at all. That first moment of existence was created by God out of nothing, from no previous condition or moment at all. And all the subsequent moments of our lives are likewise created by God as absolutely new moments. I hope you can see the implication of this description of time. You think that you are living in a continually flowing stream of time, but this appearance, Descartes implies, is an illusion. Really, your life and the duration of any created thing is a series of atomistic, non-temporal moments. When your professors were your age, they would go to a movie theater to see a motion picture. Quaint bit of history for you. This motion picture was really a projection of a series of still images, one after another, on 35mm film, projected at just such a speed that the viewer would perceive the illusion of continuous motion, even though, in fact, the screen was showing a series of discrete, completely separate images. This is an image of Descartes' view of time, and in fact, Henri Bergson long ago called Descartes' view of time the cinematographic view of time. You may be very surprised to find that Descartes holds such an apparently counterintuitive view of time. If you have read the fourth book of Aristotle's Physics, you will be righteously indignant with Descartes. I'm not trying to persuade you that this is the correct view of time, but I hope to show you that it was in fact Descartes' view. One of Descartes' contemporaries was as surprised as you are. Pierre Gassendi, a priest and a critic of Descartes, wrote to Descartes to complain on this very point. Time, Gassendi says, does not have separate parts, as Descartes has said, but is rather like a river, a flowing reality that is continuous. one might identify parts, but this is arbitrary and not a characteristic of real flowing water. Descartes responds to this objection by saying that God is not causing time in some abstract sense, but is causing the actual moments of time that are, in fact, mutually discrete. So I'm going to quote him here. This can be plainly demonstrated from my explanation of the independence of the divisions of time. You, Gassendi, try in vain to evade my argument by talking of the necessary connection which exists between the divisions of time, considered in the abstract. But this is not the issue. We are considering the time or duration of the thing which endures. And here, you would not deny that the individual moments can be separated from those immediately preceding and succeeding them, which implies that the thing which endures ceases to be at any given moment. Descartes says here that each moment of time completely ceases to exist. Since this is so, any subsequent moment must be created by God as something completely new and out of nothing. The notion that time is continuous is, according to Descartes, a mere abstraction. The real, concrete, temporal duration that we experience is a series of moments that are created by God only to go out of existence immediately. Each next moment, therefore, must be created by God as though it were the very first moment. So, that's okay. Don't want to lose any of these moments. Again, I can hear you students of Aristotle beginning to grumble. You were laughing a minute ago, now you're grumbling. That Aristotle has shown us that time is a measure of motion, and that motion is a continuous thing. In August 1649, Descartes responded to an objection from Henry More, who complained that Descartes' view of motion would not allow Descartes to explain how it is that motion, or a moving thing, could communicate with other material things or cause motion in them. Descartes responds by denying that moving things do cause other motions. Quoting Descartes here. You observe correctly that motion, being a mode of a body, cannot pass from one body to another. But that is not what I wrote. Indeed, I think that motion, considered as such a mode, continually changes. For there is one mode in the first point of a body, A, in that it is separated from the first point of a body, B, and another mode in that it is separated from the second point, and another mode that is separated from the third, and so on. But when I said that the same amount of motion always remains in matter, I meant this about the force, which impels its parts, which is applied at different times to different parts in accordance with the laws of motion. End of quotation. Motion, Descartes is telling us, is not a continuous reality, but is, like time, a series of discrete events called modes that follow one another sequentially, but are not causally related to each other. The moving thing, according to Descartes, is, like time, its measure, a series of causally separate moments. What is the implication of this? When I explained Aquinas' doctrine of creation, I tried to show how God's creative causality is completely compatible with a robust understanding of the causality of creatures. Let me now contrast the position of Descartes on this problem. Descartes describes a created world in which each moment is created ex nihilo and de novo, so out of nothing and newly. If we imagine a first moment of existence and suppose that something is completely created, never having existed before, we must imagine that the newly created substance is created, and also that every accidental attribute of it is also created at the same time. If I had not existed until this very moment, God would have to create me and also all of my not so imposing attributes. What's left of my hair would be exactly the shade of gray. My height and weight would be just the amounts that you could suppose them to be. And every wrinkle would be there, just as they are now. The point is that when something is created as completely new, every last detail of the thing must also be created at the same time. There's a little hairline scar on my left cheek caused by a baseball that I failed to catch when I was 8 years old. But if God created me as something new right now, He would have created that scar in my cheek, yet my past failures, since there would have been none, could not have been the cause of the scar. Now, on Descartes' view, each and every moment is also a first moment, and therefore everything about every created moment must be entirely created by God. If you consider the action of using a lit match to set a piece of paper on fire, all of the moments when the match is burning, all of the moments when the paper is burning, and all of the moments in which the match flame is in contact with the paper, all of these moments are being caused by God, and each moment is a completely new moment that never existed before. The implication of this is that the flame of the match is not causing the burning of the paper. And no one moment is the cause of any subsequent moment. What is true in this example is true about everything in the entire created universe. This means that no created thing can possibly be the cause of any other created thing. What we call created things are really just a collection of events described by moments, and none of these events is the cause of any subsequent events. God, on this view, is the cause of everything that happens in our universe. This position, that creatures cause nothing and God causes everything, has a name. It is called occasionalism. The occasionalist doctrine holds that all efficient causality in our world is really caused by God, although God provides this causality universally on the occasion of the apparent interaction of creatures. Thus, when the match is brought in contact with the paper, on that occasion, God causes the paper to burn. And the same is true for every motion, every alteration, every generation, and every destruction that we find in our world. My contention about Descartes, and here, ladies and gentlemen, this is the one small thing that I hope to teach you tonight. My contention is that Descartes is a thoroughgoing occasionalist. Scholars have generally agreed that Descartes has removed causality from material things. This is so because Descartes' material things are just empty shells. They are extended in 3 dimensions. They can be moved locally to various places, but they have no powers, no capacities, no abilities to do anything. They are powerless, inert lumps because Descartes has removed all possible forms or qualities from them. Thus, in what is called by the scholars body-body interactions, most scholars agree that Descartes has no room for any creaturely causality. When Descartes talks about force in material things, he means God. God is the force that moves everything. My contribution, however, is to show that Descartes' removal of causality is much more extensive. It applies to the interactions not only between 2 bodies, but between the soul and the body, between the bodily world and the soul, and even within the soul itself. All of these interactions are part of temporal duration, according to Descartes, and what is true of all temporal duration must apply to them. Thus, when I decide to snap my fingers, there's a demonstration, God is moving my fingers. When a red apple is visible to me, God is causing me to see it. And when I try to remember the name of my former students, God does, or does not, cause the name to occur to me. I am not, however, denying that Descartes has a doctrine of human free will. He clearly does. And he clearly thinks that we make free choices and are responsible for our mistakes and our sins. Our wills are free, but they can only be effective because God causes the body to move as we choose. God wills, in most instances, to bring about the bodily actions that we freely will to happen, but God does not cause our decisions. I've provided you with an interpretation that I think fairly represents Descartes' position. This interpretation implies a drastic occasionalism that might seem improbable. If Descartes really does hold this view, you might ask, shouldn't he have discussed it explicitly? In fact, however, there is no such explicit discussion anywhere in Descartes' writings. That is, he never says that he is an occasionalist, but he never denies that he is one either. One thing to realize, of course, is that the term occasionalism does not arise until well after Descartes' time. It was first used in the 18th century. He would not have applied the term to himself, of course, because it didn't exist yet. Another thing to realize is that Descartes' admission of body-body occasionalism is generally accepted by most, though not all, scholars. My interpretation is that Descartes clearly accepts the argument from the discrete moments of time as a true demonstration of God's existence. Since he accepts the soundness of this argument, he must accept the atomism of time. In turn, the atomism of time necessarily implies a universal occasionalism. My position, then, is that whether Descartes realized himself or not the implications of his metaphysics, the implications are nevertheless really there. His philosophical principles necessarily lead to occasionalism, whether Descartes saw this himself or not. It is, however, highly significant, I would say, that Descartes' immediate followers who professed to be faithful Cartesians, did see the implication that I have tried to show you tonight. Louis de Laforge, Gérard Cordemois, Arnold Herlinks, and of course Nicolas Malebranche, all claimed fidelity to Descartes' principles, and they all explicitly drew the occasionalist conclusion. Laforgue and Malebranche are especially close to Descartes' position. They hold also an atomistic view of time, and they draw the conclusion that God created every independent moment of time, with the result that no creaturely causality is possible. This is exactly Descartes' position, as I'm trying to argue. Thomas Aquinas knew of the occasionalist position, though not, of course, by that name. He regarded it as an impossible position, and he refuted it several times. Here are just three of his arguments. These are taken from the disputed question on the power of God. First, if you say that God is causing everything in our world, you remove the manifest evidence of our sense experience. Aquinas is a realist about sense experience, and we really experience that fire is the cause of heat. Second, to remove causality from created things is to suppose that creatures exist in vain. The natural operations of things flow from their substantial forms, that is, from their very natures. To suppose that something exists without an effective operation is thus to suppose that the nature of the thing counts for nothing. Thomas does not further this conclusion, but I would argue that the occasionalist position logically implies a position called phenomenalism. This is the position that things in the world do not exist because all that we know is the appearances and never the things themselves. If created things have nothing to do, why would we suppose that they even exist? Thus, Bishop Berkeley is the most faithful Cartesian disciple of them all. Third, occasionalism is a denial of God's goodness. God's generous goodness implies that God, this view of occasionalism implies that God would not give some version of his own causal powers to creatures. In fact, however, God's generosity is such that he wants his creatures to be and to act as much like him as we can. Such, then, is Aquinas' criticism of occasionalism. How might Descartes respond to these three arguments of Thomas? To the first argument, Descartes would point out that he rejects the sort of direct realism that Thomas accepts. He has labored hard, as you would know, to show that it is reasonable to doubt our sense experience. After an argument that God is not a deceiver, Descartes is willing to accord some connection between our subjective experience and what is in the world. But even then, we really have no clear and distinct idea of something like heat. Second, Descartes quite cheerfully removes all causal powers from material objects. He regards forms of any kind as artificial attempts to suppose that there are effective entities in the world. But he finds that there is no empirical or rational evidence for these forms. Further, the suggestion that Descartes' occasionalism is all but a phenomenalism is in fact very close to the position that Descartes does adopt. From the beginning to the end, we are thinking things entrapped in our own subjective consciousness. We infer from our subjective ideas that there must be some things in the world, but we never know these objects directly. Except that God would not deceive us, we could be living in a phenomenal world. Third, Descartes regards God's creative generosity as his freely willing the laws of nature. God's generosity is seen in his establishing laws of nature that are scientifically knowable through primarily mathematical analysis. This last point might help to explain Descartes' occasionalism. Descartes tells us that he has written his Meditations on First Philosophy and engaged in the elaborate program of systematic doubt precisely in order to provide a firm foundation for the new science of the 17th century. This science is fundamentally a mathematical analysis of moving bodies. Insofar as we are concerned with the mathematical principles of material things, we do not really need to talk about causality in the material world. Remember that Newton says, famously in the General Scholium, if he is asked about the cause of gravity, "I frame no hypotheses." I am trying to suggest with all of this that Descartes might not be so embarrassed by the charge of occasionalism. But this is no reason for us to accept the Cartesian view of science or of occasionalism. The answers Descartes might give to Aquinas' criticisms of occasionalism, I don't have time to argue now, but I would argue count more against Descartes than for him. We can be champions of contemporary science that has so impressively used mathematical analysis to understand the physical sciences. We do not, however, have to divorce the mathematical analysis from the more fundamental physical analysis that Aristotelians and Thomists have striven to give us. You students can turn to your own professors here at Christendom to help you with this. They are well able to do so. If you want something to read on this topic that is not too long and gives the Thomistic position, I might recommend some of the works of the late Father William Wallace, especially his article called Basic Concepts, Natural and Scientific. Thank you for your attention. I hope that I've given you some new insight into Descartes' philosophical position, and that I have reminded you of a Thomistic doctrine of creation that can help you to understand better your relationship to your Creator and to your world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
I'm just going to invite them to ask
Okay,
some questions.
great.
You can stay right here.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's said the more you learn, the more you see it, what you're being so hopefully you've learned something, and that's what those questions in your mind. And Dr. Baldner is gracious enough to field for the next 10-15 minutes any questions you might have. So please don't be shy and ask those questions. Dr. Treese will find you as you raise your hand and give you the mic. Oh, if you, I guess you could do better. Actually, just line up next to Dr. Treese. Don't be afraid. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Or you could just come up here.
Yeah. Thank you. Tremendous thought. I'm overwhelmed by it. So, I want to take from it just deep insight into the concept of nature, thinking about our relationship with God. I'm wondering whether calling Descartes thoroughgoing occasionalist here is perhaps more charitable than necessary. Because at the point when you said that, I was thinking, wow, he's really a paraplegic, occasionalist at best. And then as we continue, it sounded very much illustrating parallel sense of parallels between Descartes' thinking and Heracles. But in turn, maybe could you clarify how in typical medieval occasionalism, there's the evacuation of causality. but you still have, you know, entity A and entity B that are faced, you know, contiguity and you know, forms right so
Right.
as to bring about the apparent right, natural causality, which is that
Right.
there. But as we're speaking about Descartes' assessment of the temporal successive, the discrete moments, you underscored it, and if I understood correctly, even like the accident features, the substance as a whole, everything is altogether anew created at
Right.
peace.
Right.
And so it goes beyond this sort of framework of time, things that we associate as growing to say, right, subsisting things. It's
Right.
the things themselves. And anything that ceases to have any intrinsic identity or ontological
Right.
permanence or persistence,
Right.
which is this a fair assessment of what's actually happening?
It's a fair assessment of what could happen, but Descartes' response to that would be to say that God is completely free to will any kind of sequence of events that he might wish. But in fact, God has freely chosen to will the order of events in accord with laws of nature that human science is able to discern. So we know that God has given us laws of nature. And these laws of nature rigorously describe the motion that we will observe. Nothing of that is caused by the bodies that we observe. But it is, but you can predict with complete reliability what will happen when one ball comes into contact with another, even though the first ball doesn't move the second. But you can predict, according to the laws of nature, exactly what the resultant motion will be. So he would avoid that kind of sort of Heraclitean complete flux, I suppose, that you're alluding to. That I think would be the way he would go at that. But in terms of what God could do, you're absolutely right. It could be as bizarre as you've suggested it might be. Yeah.
Thank you. I thought that was a great lucid contrast between Thomas's position and Descartes. I was going to ask you about that just the substantial form, but you addressed that at the end of your discussion. My question is, when you spoke of how this position of Descartes not only applies to thought evolution, but even to immaterial causes, that seems to have profound consequences for like how we understand evil, right? Joseph Stalin, from child in Georgia to the monster that he became, was not the effect of his past choices against the will of God, but rather God delighted in creating him afresh every moment in the malicious way that he was. What does that do to our understanding of our agency, but also God's providence?
Descartes very much wants to keep a doctrine of human freedom. God must cause the actions that we will. So if I will to commit a murder and to fire a gun or whatever it is that I'm going to do, God has to will that my decision is affected through my bodily motions. That is true. I don't really think that Descartes has a significantly different problem, though, from any theist who recognizes that God is providentially ordering a world and creating a world. If a big part of the answer to the problem of evil is free will, the fact that human beings make free choices, then Descartes is as well or as ill able to answer that problem as anyone else, I would say.
Thank you very much, Professor Baldner, for joining us in an excellent presentation in such a way to welcome you. So thank you for coming to Christendom. I have two questions, if I may, one philosophical, one historical. The philosophical question starts from, I can recognize how occasionalism follow from ends about time if causes are temporally antecedent to effects. But can you explain, would occasionalism also still follow in the case of causes that are temporally simultaneous with their effects? Is that still a problem?
Sorry, could you say that again? Would it still follow when?
Yes, if you assume temporal simultaneity.
Oh, I see.
You still have the occasionalism problem.
No.
The occasionalism problem follow from ends about time in the supposition that causes are
Right.
temporally antecedent.
Let,
Follow it's just you could comment about the genealogy thing of the occasionalism or Descartes. Are there springs of the tradition, legal tradition, or speaking of them?
very good. So the philosophical question, if he views time as continuous and such that events are temporally simultaneous. So if the flame and the burning are really temporally simultaneous, then this argument for occasionalism would go away. There are other ways to be an occasionalist. There are other reasons, let us say, to be an occasionalist. You might be an occasionalist simply because you think that creatures have no formal qualities or properties that allow them to cause things. Descartes also holds that view about material things. So you might be an occasionalist for other reasons, but you're right in suggesting that if you take away the temporal atomism, this argument would go away. It's dependent on it, in my view. I don't think that Descartes has any connection that I've ever heard about to medieval occasionalism, say in Ghazali, al-Ghazali, or that tradition, or the Asharite Muslim thinkers. They were occasionalists. So, and I don't know that there's any connection there. I do think that there's a connection with Suarez. I don't know that I can show this, and I don't know how much to push this, but Descartes read Suarez, and Suarez has a view of what's called concurrentism, concurrence. And on Suarez's view, when I lift this paper, knock over the microphone. When I lift this paper, God is concurring in that action, and that means that God is fully causing the natural action that I am causing. Now, Descartes would have been aware of that, and that might have had some influence on him. Suarez does not have this atomistic view of time, and Suarez does not argue for creation on the basis of time in any way. He's much more like Aquinas on that. But the doctrine of concurrentism, I would argue, is problematic in itself. I think it leads to occasionalism. So, yeah, but so that's I guess the best that I can do about the genealogy. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. So I was wondering if you could defend Descartes here. So I'm thinking that he's in a little bit of a bind because if we call God the cause of things, or a cause, in Thomistic philosophy, we're using predication and analogy. But I understand what a cause is because a father causes his son, and a sculptor causes the statue to be. But if all natural things have been wrought for causality, how can the term have any meaning for Descartes? And where did he get that idea from? If he's in the third meditation.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. That's a very nice question, and you can strengthen that question by pointing to what philosophers have called the causal principle. Descartes, in the third meditation and in the sixth, talks about, it says that there must be at least as much formal reality, Descartes says, in the total and efficient cause of an effect as there is in the effect. Now, sounds a lot like he's talking, he's talking about efficient causality in things. He doesn't apply that principle very much to the analysis of physical things, except in this way. If you consider something like force, if you have a smaller quantitative designation of force, and you've got a smaller body, can the smaller body move the larger body? Well, in terms of the quantitative designation of force, the answer might be no, it can't. And so Descartes can explain this causal principle, as it is called. Descartes doesn't call it that, by the way. That contemporary philosophers call it. Descartes doesn't say that. But that principle could well be explained in terms of the mathematical physics that was developed in the 17th century. It's just that it's convenient to talk about causality. Descartes introduces that principle not to show that creatures have causes, but to show that God is the one with enough reality to cause the thing in question. He applies it, of course, to the idea of God. And but read in isolation from the argument that I've given, you'd look at that and you'd say, well, yeah, Descartes talking about efficient causality, and so I mean, I'm trying to interpret this argument, and I think it drives me to the conclusion that there can be no efficient causality, and if you add that to the fact that pretty well everybody's in agreement that Descartes has already denied efficient causality in the material world anyway, I think it makes a pretty strong case. But I have to grant that there are uses of language that out of context might make you look at that a little differently. So good point. I hope that wasn't too convoluted an answer, or that it was convoluted enough, or that should be more convoluted.
Dr. Baldner. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Baldner. We, the students, are ready to enjoy some desserts. Okay. And so we're going to allow them to go do that, enjoy coffee. But Dr. Baldner has informed me that he's going to hang around. And so for all those questions you were not able to ask or too shy to ask in front of everybody, you can ask him private over dessert and coffee. So we welcome you to enjoy those things. But as we round up the evening, please give the nice ovation to our guest.
Thank you.